He had seen the Americans coming from a distance, and he had not been afraid. Not yet. The German soldier in the winter of 1944 had been told a story about his enemy, and he believed it completely. Soft, undisciplined, a nation of salesmen playing at war. He had written as much in letters home. Then something happened that made him tear up everything he thought he knew. And the question he could not shake, the one that would follow him all the way to the end, was this: how did we get them so wrong? The answer was written in his own words. Before the first American boot touched North African sand, the German soldier already had a picture in his mind. It had been painted carefully, by propaganda, by the officers above him, by the quiet confidence of a Wehrmacht that had torn through Europe in 3 years, and believed, with some justification, that it understood war better than anyone alive. The Americans, as the story went, were amateurs. They had a small professional army, a country that had spent the better part of the 1930s arguing with itself about whether Europe's wars were any of its business at all. They had no experience of the kind of grinding, industrial-scale conflict that the Eastern Front had already become. They were rich, yes, abundantly, almost offensively rich, but richness, the German soldier had been assured, did not make a fighting man. It made a comfortable one. There was also something else underneath the official dismissal, something quieter and harder to name. A kind of contempt rooted in the belief that American society, its movies, its jazz, its mongrel mixture of peoples, could not produce the disciplined, ideologically hardened soldier that Germany had spent years forging. The German army had doctrine. It had tradition reaching back through Prussian history. It had men who had bled in Poland, France, and the vast Eastern steppe. What did America have? Factories. And boys. That was the picture. Hold it in your mind, because this entire story is about the moment it began to crack. The cracks started in North Africa, and they started badly, for both sides, though in different ways. When American forces first engaged German troops in Tunisia in early 1943, the encounter at Kasserine Pass handed the Wehrmacht what looked, on the surface, like easy confirmation of everything they had assumed. American units were pushed back. Green commanders made costly errors. The German soldier who walked through those positions afterward could have been forgiven for feeling that the propaganda had been right. But even then, in the first flush of that tactical success, some German officers were already noticing something that did not fit the story. The Americans had been beaten, yes, but they had not broken in the way that perhaps a softer army would have broken. They pulled back, regrouped, and almost immediately began doing something that the German professional could recognize and quietly respect. They learned. They adapted. They replaced commanders who had failed and put harder, sharper men in their place. General Erwin Rommel, a soldier who had very little patience for comfortable fictions, had already begun to form a different assessment. His army had fought the British for 2 years in the desert and understood what it meant to face a determined enemy who could absorb punishment. What he observed in the Americans was not the hopeless incompetence he had been led to expect. It was inexperience. And inexperience, unlike cowardice, was a condition that could be cured. The German soldier in the field may not have had Rommel's strategic eye, but he had his own way of measuring an enemy. He measured him in the small, immediate, personal terms of who was shooting back, how accurately, and how long they kept doing it after things went wrong. And by those measures, the American in front of him was not what the letters home had described. He was something that required a second look. There is a word that appears again and again when German soldiers and officers describe their growing unease about the American enemy, and the word is material. Not courage, not tactics. Material. The German soldier was a proud man with reason for that pride. He had been trained within a military tradition that emphasized initiative, flexibility, the ability of a small unit to think and act independently when the larger plan had collapsed, what the Germans called Auftragstaktik. A philosophy of mission-driven command that trusted the man on the ground. He believed, and not without evidence, that his individual training and battlefield instinct were superior. But you cannot shoot initiative at a tank. And by 1943, the Americans were arriving with tanks in numbers that felt, to the men watching from the other side of the wire, almost hallucinatory. Trucks, artillery pieces, aircraft appearing overhead in formations so large they altered the quality of the light. Supplies, food, ammunition, replacement parts, replacement. Men. Flowing forward in a volume that the overstretched German logistics system could not begin to match. Imagine what he saw when he looked at a captured American position. The rations alone were a kind of psychological assault. Men on the German side were subsisting on increasingly thin provisions by mid-war, and here was an enemy who seemed to move with an almost careless abundance. One German officer, reflecting on what he had witnessed, described the American material superiority not as an advantage, but as something closer to a force of nature, something that did not argue with you, did not negotiate, simply arrived and kept arriving until the argument was over. This was the realization that no amount of doctrine could quite prepare a man for that war, at the scale America was now waging it, had become partly an industrial competition, and in an industrial competition, Germany had already lost before the first shot was fired. But here is where the German soldier's account becomes most interesting, and most uncomfortable for the assumptions he had started with, because the material alone does not explain what the men across the wire were doing with it. By the Italian campaign and then the grinding months after Normandy, German soldiers who had fought Americans long enough to form a considered opinion were saying things in letters and diaries and, later, in prisoner interviews, that they would not have been willing to say in 1942. They described American infantrymen as aggressive, willing to take ground at real cost, and, perhaps most surprisingly to men who had been told they were fighting salesmen, stubborn in defense in a way that demanded genuine respect. The American soldier fought differently than the British, differently than the Soviet, and the German noticed the difference. There was an improvisational quality to American small unit tactics that the Wehrmacht's own tradition of independent thinking could, reluctantly, recognize as a kind of kinship. When a plan broke down, the American did not simply stop. He found another way. He pushed from a different angle. He called in support with a speed and confidence that spoke of a man who had been trained to believe the support would actually come, and it did, which was its own kind of lesson. What emerged in the German accounts from these middle years of the war is a portrait of an enemy being mentally reclassified. He had arrived as an amateur. He was being quietly, reluctantly reclassified as a professional. Not the same kind of professional as the German. There remained, in many accounts, a sense that the German soldier believed his individual training and tactical heritage remained superior, but a professional nonetheless, one who would not stop, one who had the whole weight of an untouched continent behind him and the absolute intention to use it. Hit subscribe right now, because what the German soldier admitted next, in his own words, is the part that changes everything about how you understand this war. Do not go anywhere. The individual soldier's evolving opinion of the American enemy was one thing. What makes it echo across history is how faithfully it was reflected by the men at the top, men who understood the full strategic picture and who, in the privacy of correspondence or the strange candor of post-war interrogation, said things that propaganda had spent years trying to prevent. German officers captured or interviewed after the war's end described American generalship in terms that surprised some of their interlocutors. There was criticism. The German professional could rarely resist pointing out what he believed were American tactical inefficiencies, the perceived over-reliance on firepower where maneuver might have served better, the cautiousness in certain operations that a more aggressive commander might have exploited differently. These were professional criticisms, the kind one soldier offers another. But beneath the criticism was something more substantial and harder to dismiss. German officers described American logistical organization as essentially without parallel in their experience of the war, a system so vast, so reliable, and so intelligently managed that it functioned almost like a separate weapon. The ability to move hundreds of thousands of men across an ocean, supply them continuously, and sustain offensive operations across multiple theaters simultaneously was something the German military mind, however grudgingly, acknowledged as a genuine form of military genius. Not glamorous. Not the kind of genius that gets celebrated in the histories of great battles. but genius nonetheless. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, reflecting on the campaign in the West, spoke of the American capacity to recover from setbacks with a speed that he found, in retrospect, deeply unsettling. Not because individual battles had been lost, battles were always lost, but because the Americans seemed constitutionally incapable of accepting that a setback was permanent. They came back, always, with more men, more material, and what appeared to be a completely undiminished belief that the outcome was not in doubt. That belief, von Rundstedt suggested, was itself a kind of force. It shaped how the American soldier carried himself, how quickly he returned to the attack, how little he seemed to entertain the possibility of ultimate failure. The German soldier had been told the American lacked conviction. What he found instead was a man who had simply never been given a serious reason to doubt. There is another place where the German soldier's private opinion of the American enemy was recorded, and it is perhaps the most intimate, in the prisoner of war camps, where men spoke without the performance that combat demanded. German POWs held by American forces described their captors with a complexity that the simple narrative of victor and vanquished cannot quite contain. There was, in many accounts, a genuine puzzlement at the American character, at the informality, the apparent lack of rigid hierarchy, the way an American officer might speak to an enlisted man in a register that would have been unthinkable in the Wehrmacht. Some German prisoners found this confusing, even faintly disrespectful of military order. Others found it, after enough time, unexpectedly human. What consistently struck the German prisoner, and what appears in account after account, was the dissonance between what he had been told and what he found himself experiencing. He had been told the American was cruel in victory, corrupted by the materialist values of a shallow culture. What he found was a captor who, by the measures of a world war being conducted with extraordinary brutality in many of its theaters, behaved with a professionalism and, in many documented cases, a decency that the prisoner had not anticipated and could not easily dismiss. This was not sentimentality. The German prisoner was a trained soldier who knew how to evaluate the men around him. What he was recording, in letters that sometimes reached home and in post-war testimonies, was an assessment, cool, professional, reluctant, of an enemy who had turned out to be something other than the story. Remember what he believed at the start? Here is where it breaks. The prisoner sitting in that camp had once written home about American softness. He had once believed, with the comfortable certainty of a man who had not yet been tested by the thing itself, that the gap between German military culture and American military culture was so vast as to be essentially unbridgeable. He was now on the other side of that belief, and the distance between where he had started and where he had arrived was the full length of the war. If the human confession was intimate, the statistical reality that underscored it was vast and cold and impossible to argue with. By the final years of the war, the German soldier on the Western Front was facing an accumulation of American power that had no precedent in his experience of fighting. The numbers that filtered through to the men at the front, in rumors, in the evidence of their own eyes, in the reports that officers sometimes shared because there was no longer much point in concealing them, described an enemy that was not diminishing, it was growing. Every month, more divisions. Every week, more aircraft. The 8th Air Force alone, by the later war years, was dispatching bombing formations of a size that men on the ground found almost impossible to process as a military reality. 1,000 aircraft, in a single day, more. The German soldier understood attrition. He had been living inside it for years. But attrition, as he understood it, was something that worked in both directions. You accepted losses because you believed the enemy was accepting comparable losses and would, at some point, find those losses insupportable. What America represented was the rupture of that logic. A nation that could absorb its losses, replace them entirely, and return to the line at undiminished strength had essentially removed the mechanism by which the German soldier had learned to believe in eventual victory. This was the quiet, grinding realization that did not come in a single dramatic moment, but accumulated across months and years of fighting. It was not a battlefield defeat. It was a mathematical one, arrived at in the mind of a man who had been trained to think clearly about odds and had finally, with great reluctance, finished the calculation. What the German soldier thought of the American, in the end, was not what he had been told to think. And the distance between those two things is the real story of this war, told from the inside. He had been given a portrait of a weak enemy, and he had fought his way to an honest reckoning with a formidable one. Not formidable in the way he had always defined the word, not in the tradition-heavy, doctrine-forged, ideologically certain sense that the German military culture prized, but formidable in ways that, ultimately, mattered more. Formidable in endurance, formidable in adaptation, formidable in the sheer, relentless, almost casual confidence of a nation that had decided the war was winnable and had organized the entirety of its industrial and human capacity around proving it. The German soldier who survived the war carried that reckoning with him. In post-war interviews and memoirs, what emerges is not bitterness toward the American enemy, or not primarily bitterness, but something closer to a complicated respect, arrived at the hard way, through the experience of being wrong about someone for long enough to understand fully the cost of that error. He had once read a letter by candlelight and written home about the enemy he expected. The man who came home, if he came home, had written a different kind of letter entirely, one that did not match the first, one that admitted, in the careful language of a professional soldier who still had his pride, that the Americans had been something other than what he had been promised. That admission, quiet, human, earned through years of blood and cold and mathematical certainty closing in from every direction, is the closest thing to the truth of this war that the losing side ever gave us. Not in a speech, not in a surrender ceremony. In the private language of men who had finally stopped lying to themselves about what they had encountered. And that, perhaps, is the most honest thing a soldier can do. The German soldier had asked himself, in the winter of 1944, how they had gotten the Americans so wrong. By the end, he had his answer. They had been told a story about an enemy who did not exist, and they had believed it because it was easier, and because belief, when you are far from home and the cold is serious and the line is thin, is the thing you guard most carefully. The story had felt true. It had felt earned by history and doctrine and the long record of German military achievement. But the American had not read that story. He had simply arrived. With his abundance, his adaptability, his absolute refusal to accept the ending that had been written for him. And he had rewritten it. One position at a time. One replaced commander at a time. One returned formation at a time. What German soldiers really thought of American troops, in the end, was this. We did not know what they were until it was too late to do anything about what we knew. That is not a battlefield truth. It is a human one, and it belongs to both sides of every war ever fought. If this story stayed with you, subscribe and turn on notifications. Every week we tell the war through the eyes of those who lost it. If you found value here, leave a like so more people can find their way to this side of the story. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We read every one. We'll see you in the next one.